So welcome everyone to our alumni and our guests to a very special King's Expert Series webinar. We are absolutely delighted that today's webinar is being led by King's new President and Principal, Professor Shitij Kapur. And he will be guiding a conversation around the importance and impact of universities and King's College London in particular in this para-COVID world. Professor Kapur is being joined by an absolutely outstanding panel of experts from across King's. Julia Gillard, who's chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, Professor Adam Fagan, who's our interim Vice President of Education here at King's, and Professor Jeremy Sanderson, who is consultant gastroenterologist and clinical director of gastrointestinal medicine and surgery at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And also he's Professor of Gastroenterology at King's College London. And he's also been the COVID clinical lead at Guy's and St Thomas's until very recently. So he's very well appraised of what's been going on in a very busy hospital. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. And we will have time after our panelists have spoken to get around as many of the questions as we can. So thank you to everyone for joining, and thank you to our panelists. And I'd now like to hand over to Professor Shitij Kapur.
Thank you, Jenny, and hello, everyone. And a very warm welcome to our alumni, to our students and friends who are joining us today for the King's Expert Series. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Shitij, and it is wonderful to connect with so many of you for this important conversation. But before we get to the topic at hand, I wanted to take this opportunity to share with you some news from King's. Now, as some of you might know, I joined King's as President and Principal in June, although I've had the pleasure of working at King's before, as I was the Executive Dean of the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. It's a privilege to be back at King's, especially at such an unprecedented time. Over the last 6 weeks, we have been busy welcoming students for the start of a new academic year. Now, I have to tell you, it's a new academic year like none other. And I must say, I'm incredibly energized to see the excitement of our students to be back on campus after a disruption of the last year and more. And I'm also excited about the enthusiasm of staff to be back on campus, and the fact that we've managed a safe return on campus for nearly 25,000 people. But as you come to the campus, you'll notice some exciting changes. First is the development of the quad space on the Strand campus. And now you might remember there used to be the King's building that ran north-south, and then there was the Somerset House East Wing, which also ran north-south, and between them was the space that was called the quad. And until recently, if you visited it, it was a car park, and then the cars were taken out and it was just a tarmac covered sort of featureless space. Well, all of that has changed. It's a beautiful quad now with 4 stories of engineering research labs and teaching spaces below ground. It's a most marvelous piece of engineering itself, which has retained some of the old features of the King's building underground and has built brand new engineering labs. Now, just as that was happening in the quad, if you walked out now from the quad to the Strand, the street, you would remember Strand as the sort of 4 busy lanes of highways, and at least I always saw double-decker buses and taxis running across it. Well, all of that has been quietened. The Strand has been pedestrianized. It's called the Strand Aldwych Project, and now there is no traffic on it anymore. It's all being paved with beautiful stone, which will be continuous with the quad. So we'll have a wonderful plaza, almost a European-style plaza in the heart of London. And of course, we want this plaza to be the beating heart of education and culture, and that's what we're working on. That's just the Strand campus. Earlier this year, we also broke ground for what's called the Piers Maudsley Centre for Children and Young People in Denmark Hill. And I would like to thank many of the alumni and other donors who've made it possible for us to build what will be Europe's largest centre devoted to the mental health of children and young people. It'll be the first of its kind in the UK, which will bring together not only world-class clinical services, but also research, education, outreach, and policy development related to children and young people's mental health. And I'm sure you'll agree at a time like this that there could be nothing more important than that. And that leads us very nicely to the focus of our conversation today, which is how do we learn to live in this para-COVID world? Now, that's a cumbersome word, para-COVID. We didn't know what else to call it. We thought it would be hostage to fortune and perhaps incorrect to say it was post-COVID. But also at the same time, one has to recognize that we're not in the midst of a lockdown anymore and have to find a way to live with this new reality. And that's where we think kings in particular could play an important role in shaping what this new normal would look like. Now, one big lesson from COVID is that the real challenges of this world or real challenges of our society, like COVID or climate, they do not fold themselves neatly into the confines of a single discipline. So no single discipline or no single perspective has a monopoly on the future. So if you take COVID, it started as a viral problem and you thought, well, maybe the immunologists and the doctors are all that we need. But of course, as it grew, we realized how it impacted almost everything. Perhaps most importantly, it made a call on human behavior. We had to change that. Then we found a vaccine, which you might say as well, that's something the molecular biology scientists do. But once the vaccine came, all the issues of manufacturing came up. Then you got manufacturing figured out, then all manners of transportation and logistics came up. And of course, in the midst of all of that was economy. And that just shows how it is all so interwoven, interlinked, and interdependent. And therein lies the opportunity of a university like King's, because we're not just about one discipline or one area, but we have the unique opportunity to bring all of them together in the service of society. And that's probably what you'll hear more from our panelists here today. So I'm delighted to be joined today by a panel of three experts who will be sharing how work in their field is contributing to King's vision, but more broadly about how universities can make the world a better place. We'll start hearing about the challenges in health and how new knowledge has helped overcome that and what lies in the future. We'll then move to talking about what this actually means for the business of education in universities. And then, of course, we want to see what impact this has for society, but with a particular emphasis on the role and challenges for women in society in a post-COVID world. So I will start with Professor Jeremy Saunderson. He's a consultant gastroenterologist and a clinical director of GI medicine and surgery at the Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. And he's, of course, a professor at King's College London. Jeremy played a leading role in leading the clinical response of Guy's and St Thomas's to COVID. So Jeremy, over to you to tell us how it all went and where you think it's going.
Thank you very much, Shitij, and thank you, everyone. Yes, as you say, you may wonder why a prof of gastroenterology is talking to you about this, but I had the fortune, or some may say misfortune, of putting my hand up as the operational clinical lead, and with some absolutely amazing colleagues from this institution, we've led us through this extraordinary period. You might say the worst of times, but in a way it's also been the best of times because of all the learning and coming together that's gone on. As with the challenges you're just about to hear from my colleagues in other disciplines, exactly as Shitij has just said, there was a massive impact on the research being undertaken at King's and across King's Health Partners. I mean, almost an overnight cessation, tragically. However, what we did see is the sort of full weight of the academic expertise, the enthusiasm, the drive of the King's GSTT, King's Health Partners setup into COVID-related research, and the extraordinary array of translational research that absolutely impacted on our clinical practice and outcomes for this disease. You may be aware, and we're quite proud of this, that GSTT as an organisation had the best survival figures for COVID in the whole of the UK, and it's something we're very proud of. And there's certainly a view that because our response was data-driven, and because all of the individuals, it being clinical scientists, clinical academics, and harnessing the power of King's, that translated into these good outcomes. And it wasn't just basic good clinical care, it was data research-driven. There are numerous examples. We were the biggest recruiters to the REMCAP community-acquired pneumonia study, the COVID pneumonia adaptive trial, proving that which options were best, and translating these to optimal outcomes very quickly. There's the Monaco trial, a cellular therapy trial run through the BRC at King's, looking at scarring in the lung disease. Many of you may have seen on the BBC or from the Zoe app that Tim Spector developed, which has had an enormous influence on mapping the symptoms and changes in how we deal with this disease nationally and indeed internationally. The rare and distressing hyperinflammatory syndrome in children was defined by our clinical academic colleagues in the Evelina Children's Hospital. The list goes on and on. It's a very proud list. I wouldn't stop without mentioning our contribution to the vaccination program, both organisationally, developmentally, and research. Again, we delivered and have delivered more vaccines at this organisation than anywhere else in the country. We, at one point in the beginnings, we delivered 2% of the country's vaccines, which, if you think about it, is a massive undertaking. But we immediately set up a research aspect to this and collaborated particularly on the AZ vaccine trials. And that machinery remains very much intact as we go forward into further work on how to optimize things in the new para-COVID world as we're describing it. Finally, you asked me, Shitij, to reflect on how hospitals have changed. Clearly everything's different, and we really are at a very critical moment where healthcare, quite frankly, everywhere, have to decide whether we believe in vaccination and treat COVID like we would any other endemic viral disease. It's a pivotal moment indeed in all shaping, as our institution is helping to do, shaping the views nationally and indeed internationally. We have to do this because we need to return clinical care, clinical healthcare environments and research environments to normality. We have to protect each other, we have to protect staff, we have to protect research participants. And the way we do it is what we refer to as exemplary infection prevention and control, exemplary IPC. And we need to release ourselves from the restrictions of spacing and limited number of people on lists and this type of thing, and move on. And by doing so, we believe in vaccination like we do for influenza, like we do for other viral diseases. In that way, all the good that comes from translating the excellent research done at King's and King's Health Partners will once again be maximised. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you for sharing that. You've raised a number of important points to which I'd like to return. How fast trials got done. I mean, usually it takes 17 years to take basic discovery. And then, of course, the use of digital, and the Zoe app, has gone viral, if that's the right word. It's got more people signed on to it than almost any other health app at the moment. Well, we'll return to those. But first, let me dip into the world of the university. And I'm delighted that we have with us the Vice President of Education for King's College London. It's Professor Adam Fagan. He joined the Department of Political Economy in 2019 as a Professor of European Politics, and was also the Vice Dean of Education for the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy. And when doing all of that, the last thing he could have imagined is that he would have run a university educational enterprise that was remote. Because I'm sure in March of 2020, if I would have told Adam, you'll run this university, but there'll be no one on campus. How are you going to do it? You wouldn't have known. But nonetheless, we've done it successfully. So Adam, how did we do it? What were the highlights? What didn't perhaps go as well? And what does this mean for the future?
Thank you, Shitij. Well, we did it, and it was miraculous. It was done in record time. People were skilled up in days. You could almost see it happening. That we quickly put training resources in place, and we We put everything, all of our teaching and learning online. We delivered all of the outcomes for our programs. Of course, we never said at any point that it was the same experience for our students. We were very conscious throughout that the difficulties that students were facing studying in their homes, in their students' residences, in their bedrooms or wherever. But in terms of what they learned and the quality of the material, I think we did a really outstanding job. It revealed a lot of things. It revealed our limitations in terms of our own knowledge and our own skills, and the absolute urgency of learning how to use digital platforms very quickly. Of course, we weren't alone in that, but it did highlight the opportunities for a blended or flexible delivery. And I think it also illustrated, first and foremost, the absolute resilience of our students. It's very interesting, and Shitij, you and I have talked about this, but attendance has never been higher. You know, students are going to everything that's offered to them. And some people say, well, this won't last, or maybe it's just, you know, the novelty will wear off in a few weeks. But actually, cautious optimism, I think, you know, we've all learned what's important, and both in terms of what we deliver, how we deliver it. So I think it was a tremendous, as difficult as it all was, I think we'll conclude in the future that in terms of education, there was an awful lot of good for us, and that where we end up will be as much a product of what we did in those rather hellish 15 months under great pressure. In terms of my vision, it's simple, really, in terms of articulating it. I want to make sure that we emphasize student success as much as we emphasize the student experience. And that's very important for a university such as ours, where we have probably the most diverse students, but also at the same time, the most excellent students. Our students come in with very high ambitions, and whether they come in from first in their family to go to university, or where everybody from miles around has been to university, the thing that unites them is the fact that they come in with the top grades. They have the highest career expectations and aspirations, and we absolutely must deliver on success as well as delivering a first-class experience. The other thing that I'm determined we will be sector leading on is that at the moment we are caught in a public debate around on-campus versus online. And of course, we have done everything to get as much of our teaching on campus as we possibly can. But I think that's yesterday's dichotomy. What I want to get to as quickly as possible at King's is that it's integrated. The digital is high quality, it's integrated into face-to-face delivery. And students come onto our fantastic campus to learn in the digital space as well as in the face-to-face conventional setting. And finally, data. What we learned over the COVID period was that data on our students, how they were performing, whether they were well, whether they were engaged, what difficulties we were having, is absolutely essential. We cannot deliver an improvement in student success without using data in a smart way. And that is a huge challenge for us. At the moment, we have a plethora of opportunities for our students. We've got students with massive amount of preferences and ideas, and we've got a huge student number. And the only way we can connect those three things is with using data in a smart way. So that's a big challenge for us. But I think it's, again, where we can genuinely be sector leading. Thank you. And I think I was asked one final thing, which was the new normal.
Yes.
The phrase is, I've just seen it. I went to get lunch. It was absolutely crowded, which was fantastic. And I sat next to a young first-year student, and they were watching a TED talk or something. And I asked them, "What are you watching? What's this? Do you mind?" He said, "Oh no, I've got a lecture next on something to do with the global economy." He said, "And I'm just watching this before I go in. It was given by the professor as part of some." And I thought, this is it. This is the perfect mix of the digital on campus, and then he's going off to have a conventional face-to-face lecture in an auditorium. So that's the new normal. Thank you.
There we go. Well, so nicely described. Adam, thank you very much. You you raised some very important questions that perhaps we never really reflected on. We never asked ourselves, what is the campus for? Because it was always there. And I think having lost it and then having regained it, it's given us a newfound appreciation as to what is the role of the physical campus, because it is now dissociable from just an online education. So, well, we'll reflect more on that. And could I also urge you now, a number of you on the call here are our alumni. You obviously have had experiences of a King's education before. We'd be very interested in hearing your questions as to what you thought about how we responded to COVID. But if you have questions about how we did respond to COVID. Now, as I said, this is one of those once in a lifetime events, and I sincerely do hope it is once in a lifetime for me and for all of you that we've gone through this global pandemic. And it isn't just about what happens in health and education, though it might have started from that sector in one way. It is, of course, it has become everyone's business. Everyone's life has been upturned. But as one looks at the impact of it, it hasn't been equal. It has impacted lower stratas of society more. It has impacted those people who were not able to shift their work to working from home more. And even when we were able to work from home, even within homes, one found it impacted women more than men. And some fear that it might leave a permanent scarring, as is the technical term for permanent damages of a pandemic, in the trajectories and roles and options for women in the world ahead of us. And no one has given more thought to those sorts of issues than our next speaker, and that's Julia Gillard. She's the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. And of course, as all of us know, prior to that, the Prime Minister and the only woman to have served as Prime Minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013. But that's not all of what she has done. Just relating to the few things I've already said, Julia chaired something called Beyond Blue, which is a mental health charity that provides a distinguished and world-leading service in Australia. And then, of course, Julia, you're now the chair of the Wellcome Trust. So very warm welcome to you. But your thoughts on the pandemic, its role beyond health and education, its impact on women?
Thank you very much, and I'll do my best to address those topics. I did want to start with just two small p political trends, which I think may be shaping of our future. And the first of them really relates to what Jeremy said. I mean, we entered this pandemic in an era where there was much disputation about the role of science in public policy decision-making. We'd lived through Climate Gate, for example, and there was climate change denialism everywhere. We'd lived through an era where people were publicly questioning the value of expertise in public policy decision-making. And the optimistic side of me hopes that we emerge into this para-COVID world having recentered around the importance of science and evidence in public policy decision-making. At the end of the day, people like me who are not scientists have spent countless hours watching online, watching the television to hear chief medical officers and other forms of scientists tell us what to do next and what to expect next. And so I think that that's had a steadying effect about recentering evidence and science in public policy decision-making. And I think it is for us, for universities, for those who care about knowledge and evidence, to now make sure we don't lose that coming out of the pandemic. And then number two, I do think in some ways this has reminded the community that the quality of government matters. And by that, I don't just mean the quality of individual politicians, but also of the institutions of government. I think it was possible going into the pandemic for many people to say to themselves in democracies around the world, well, it really doesn't matter to me who's in government. You get one lot, then you get another lot, but really it doesn't touch my life in any meaningful way. I think the pandemic has shown very clearly that literally your chances of living or dying depended on the quality of public policy decision-making of politicians and of government institutions. And I hope we take that with us too, and that injects a new sense of seriousness in some democratic debates and a new focus when people go to exercise their vote about what they're looking for in the leadership of their nations. And then coming more specifically to the impact of the pandemic on women. Of course, right at the centre of the pandemic is the virus, and the virus disproportionately kills men. But when we move to the ripple effects of the pandemic very quickly, we see a gendered effect. First and foremost, those who have been at the front lines of dealing with people during the pandemic and therefore personally most at risk, our health and caring workforces, are disproportionately women. When you look at the industries that closed down rapidly as a result of the economic shock of the pandemic, they tended to be the most feminised industries. When you looked at where domestic labour fell as people retreated into lockdowns with things like homeschooling, the extra domestic burdens disproportionately fell on the shoulders of women. And my favourite statistic to paint that picture actually comes out of research here in the United Kingdom, which shows that in male-female couples where both work full-time and she is the highest income earner, even in that situation, the extra domestic labour required because of lockdowns and homeschooling fell on the woman. So this is not a rational economic choice made by who is the most valuable income earner. It's a gendered-based choice, and it was women who were stepping up to that extra burden. And then if you think about who has spoken to the community about the pandemic and its many effects, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership did a research project using natural language processing techniques to analyse acres and acres of news material in the UK and in a number of countries around the world, and even controlling for where the political leader, the Prime Minister or the President was a man, we found that disproportionately the voices heard during the pandemic were male voices. So, for example, your likelihood of hearing a woman economist talk about the impact of the pandemic was 1 in 15 rather than being anywhere near half. And we think that does matter for the discourse. So where to now? Well, the World Economic Forum, which each year tracks gender equality and our progress towards achieving it globally, tells us that we've lost a generation because of the pandemic. Their current estimates are we will not reach gender equality in health, education, political leadership and economic empowerment until 130 odd years have gone by, which is obviously far too long to wait. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some opportunities in front of us. And I think this builds on what Adam says, this question of how we integrate, not in all workforces, because many occupations do require personal attendance, but in many working life situations, it is possible now to have a mix of virtual and in-person, the way we are imagining the future of education. In real time, many businesses are making the decisions right now about what that's going to look like. And at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we are delving very deeply into this because we are concerned that employers will think they're doing the right thing by saying, let's be as flexible as possible. Let's people optionalise around how much they do virtually, how much they do in the office. But unless you do that really thoughtfully and then change a lot of other things about how your organisation works, we are very concerned we'll wake up in 5 or 10 years' time where men have disproportionately gone back to the office, women with the extra domestic load have disproportionately worked from home. Men are more visible, women are more invisible. And if you don't do a whole lot of things to take that into account, it will be very easy for men to be the ones who are visible to those making the decisions about promotions, training opportunity, networking, mentoring, and the list goes on. So we are working very hard now in real time to try and analyse what is happening as the structures of work change. One of the deep dives we've been doing has been around gender pay because we think that that helps us see as a diagnostic a lot of what is happening in the workforce around gender. So much to do and much to think about. And I'm very keen to be involved in the discussion to come and the questions to come around any and all of the content, which I've found fascinating. So thank you.
Julia, thank you very much for joining us. And I think you started up on the note of optimism that, there's greater room for science. And you're quite right. I've watched news conferences in several countries now, and everywhere you see the prime minister or the president always flanked for the last 18 months with something like a chief medical officer. It's almost as if they're a strut in a way. So that was very good. You'd also write about the quality of government matters, but perhaps you left us with a very sobering message, particularly that particular statistic you shared, that even where the woman was the higher earning person, so it's not a rational economic decision. Sadly, it's very deeply socially ingrained. And it'll be our task to change it. All right. Thank you to all of the panelists. And I would really seek your questions now. Please feel free to direct your questions to the panel in general or to a particular speaker. But perhaps I want to go back to you, Jeremy. Most of us who looked at medicine from a little distance have found, all these trials, they take forever. They're double-blind, they're randomized. Even getting an ethics approval takes 3 months. And here in the midst of COVID, we were able to put all of that aside and deliver results with these new adaptive trials in a matter of weeks and months. So how did that happen? And more importantly, why didn't it happen before?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the simple answer, or the easy answer, is obviously all the other research had stopped. And I think everyone looked very jealously at the speed with which, knowing at the same time, painfully, the other studies had stopped and how long it had taken. If you recall, there was also an anxiety about this speed, wasn't there, particularly in the vaccine studies, that those to be vaccinated wanted to ask questions about the effectiveness of all of those processes, quite rightly, but most of it related to the effect of downing tools. However, now there is absolute learning, and a lot of our senior academic colleagues now are determined that we will learn from this and work out how we can fast track the approval of studies, the ethics approval, all the various regulatory processes, and even when they're commercial studies, those commercial contracting processes. It would be fantastic to think that we came out of the pandemic with a more streamlined, effective approach, whether that's manpower, whether that's process, whether that's attitude. I would all love to see that, because the people who will benefit will be patients.
Yes, they will. And I'm seeing now that our questions are streaming in, and David Martinelli, who studied Spanish with us in 1991, was the president of the King's New York Alumni Association. If you're in New York, good morning, it would be to you, David. You ask a very pertinent question. I made a pitch just now, how the world is all interconnected, all of the disciplines are interconnected, and how we need all of this information. But David, you rightly point out that the tradition in the US is really more for a 4-year undergraduate education that is much more broad. So you may go in wanting to study economics or something else, but you're almost required to take other minors, and you come up with a more rounded education. Whereas our British system is a bit shorter, so there's only 3 years, and you may only come out having learned Spanish or something like that. So Adam, the world is interconnected. Is our education too monothematic, and what are we going to do about it?
It's a very interesting question. I don't think it is. I think we have made a lot of progress in the period prior to the pandemic. I mean, King's has always, particularly in my own field, social science and arts and humanities, and I'm sure it's reflected elsewhere, a focus on interdisciplinarity and to really construct very innovative and different degree programs. My own department, political economy, is pretty unique. That there's not a separate politics department and economics department. We fuse those. So I think we're in a good position to move forward on further flexibility and opening up our curricula. You know, there is a huge debate around decolonization. This is something that we certainly want to engage with. Many of our students have an awful lot to say about the way we teach as well as what we teach. And I think it has always been part of our continual process of refreshing curricula and looking at different ways of teaching. I think it would be wrong to say we've achieved or we've arrived at where we want to be. We are very much transitional. But I think given the academics that we have on board and given how vibrant our student body is and how determined they are, that we won't, you know, the grass will not grow under our feet, that I think the next few years really will see a very different kind of model. For me, it's about moving us away from a specifically English model, which has always been very, very narrow in terms of you come to university to study geography and that's what you do, towards a more European, or dare I say Scottish approach, where we open out and we you know, and that's not doesn't suit every student, but I think we've got a lot of progress to make in that area.
And while I have you on the screen, this was a broad theoretical question, a more practical question. During the COVID period, how did you deal with assessments? You know, that's something that occupies a student a lot. How were the exams done?
Well, we did what all of our competitors did, really, which was we scrambled around. We obviously cancelled face-to-face exams, in-person exams, and we did, you know, timed exams. But the most important thing we had to do, well, there were two things. One is we had to make sure that we weren't putting students under undue pressure. So the sort of scaffolding around mitigating circumstances and making sure that we were as liberal and open to supporting students, that was critical. But the second thing was it really reinforced the fact that we woefully over-assess. We assess in very conventional ways. And actually, we're still, despite the rhetoric, we assess learning. We don't assess for learning. So I think, again, we did learn a lot. What I had to do for my faculty...
Adam, if I may, this might be a bit technical for the rest of us. What do you mean? Okay. We assess learning, but we do not assess for learning?
I think some of our assessment, I think we have a tendency to think everything has to be assessed. I think we over-assess, we do too much of it. And what we had to do in the dark days of the pandemic, we had to say, okay, what does this student really need to be assessed on to make sure they've reached the learning objectives of their degree program or their module? And actually, it really focused us on that. So, you know, we had to be pretty utilitarian, but I think we achieved something that was, you know, is quite impressive. I think there wasn't a single student that left us that hadn't had rigorous assessment, appropriate assessment. But I hope we delivered all of that in a way that had integrity, but also sensitivity.
Well, then, you know, Elizabeth Fagan has a question for us, which is, do you know what the dropout rate was? Was there a higher dropout rate during the sort of COVID year than we normally do?
We anticipated there would be, but in fact, all of the data suggests there wasn't. Students took longer. We gave them longer to return assessments. We extended what we call our mitigating circumstances processes and all that sort of thing. But the majority of our students, wherever they were learning, whether they went back home, they went overseas, or they stayed in halls of residences, they stayed with us and we supported them. And so in many respects, it was very successful for King's.
It was, and we may not have the data on this, but since Julia's next, I thought I might ask you this question before I hand it over to her. Do we know if there was a differential effect on student achievement by gender?
Well, this is absolutely fascinating because, and you're right, we don't have the full data, but we did see during this period a significant improvement in the attainment gap between our white students and now we haven't yet looked at all of the data to do with gender, but certainly some of the improvements we made in pastoral support and care, the architecture we put around degree programs, I think there's a lot being written about how that benefited students who otherwise perhaps might have struggled. So I think in some ways, I'm not trying to paint a picture that we got, it's better than what we would have delivered under normal circumstances, but we definitely put in place support packages that I think, it benefited certain parts of our student body. And we've got to really make sure we don't lose that.
Right. Now, of course, I should add to that. There are some cynics who say that students had little else to do, and all they had to do was study, and maybe that is what has helped this attainment gap. But let's leave that cynical comment on the side, and let me return to you, Julia, to this rather troubling statistic that you shared, that in 2 years we've been put behind a generation, and that would be very disappointing, almost disheartening to everyone around. That these are hard issues to work on, and in 2 years we could almost have wiped out the gain that a generation was to make. So first, if you could just put that in perspective, how does that number come about? But secondly, of course, what can we now do to at least get back to where we used to be if we can't get ahead?
I think a lot of the number would have been in the domain about economic equality. So the World Economic Forum tracks across 4 domains, health and education, and in most high-income countries, we don't see significant gaps in health and education, though they continue to be major features of low-income countries. And so completely globally, we continue to see significant gaps as in political equality and economic empowerment. And I do think the immediate effect of the pandemic was very severe on women's employment. There is some evidence coming through that it is leading to reduced labour force participation, that even women whose jobs weren't lost during the pandemic by the force of the pandemic itself, when there was the sort of crunch moment of lockdowns and homeschooling and all the rest of it. It was women who surrendered employment to try and make the family unit ready to withstand all of the trials to come. And we don't know whether that's going to persist as a backward step in labour force participation. So, all of that is concerning, and, we aren't, even in the years before the pandemic, we weren't seeing the rate of progress in political empowerment and economic empowerment that we wanted to see. But I guess the reverse side of the coin is it does mean, if we put our mind to it, that we can change these things quite quickly. And one of the things that makes me think, now is the time for us to be absolutely doubling down on work in the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and the cause of gender equality generally, is that when society has had a huge disruption, there is more opportunity to pursue profound change than if you're in a steady as you go environment. You did mention in the introduction, one of the things I do is I chair a major mental health body in Australia, Beyond Blue. And I've certainly learned from Beyond Blue that in the mental health field, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but we also talk about post-traumatic growth, which is when individuals have had a major lifetime shock. That can be the moment that they stop, reassess, reshape their lives. And I think at an individual level, we've all been doing that as a result of COVID. I think many of us have had individual conversations about how we're going to restructure our lives so we simply don't go back to the amount of travel, the amount of time away from home, the frenzied sense of obligations about after work activities that we used to have, that we're going to think and choose differently. And if we're doing that at an individual level, I do genuinely believe we can do that at a societal level. And if we say to ourselves, we're going to, build this new normal with equity, equality, including gender equality at the centre, we can make some big transformative shifts right now.
You are indeed inspiring when you talk of those matters, but I think you're quite right. If one looks back just to the history of our nation here, I think 1948 was quite an important year. I have here with us on the panel someone who represents health and education. perhaps some of the most transformative changes that have come in the broad area of health and education here came through NHS and the expansion of university to many, many more people than it was available. And it all happened after the Second World War. And when one reads about that time, it wasn't a particularly pleasant time. Now we look back and think, oh, well, that's great, we got the NHS. But if you actually read the debates of how NHS came about, how uncertain a time it was, how many different opinions there were, and doctors of all the people were the one who were opposing NHS. It's interesting how social change happens, but you're quite right in saying that perhaps a post-acute pandemic time is a time to get people's attention into those. Now, we've got questions coming in, and a very relevant question for someone who says, my degree was in biochemistry. And they're all too aware of the importance of actual lab work. So Adam, how did we manage to give someone a degree in biochemistry when they weren't on campus at all for the last year?
Well, it was hugely challenging, and we worked very closely with particularly our colleagues at UCL and the other London Russell Group universities who faced the same challenge. I mean, I think the simplest answer to the question, the way we did it really was we recalibrated what we delivered as part of the degree and when we delivered it. So I mean, that wasn't always possible, but in a sense, I suppose we knew that the period of lockdown was, likely to be, a temporary period. And so some of the theoretical content was delivered first, and there's been a rapid process of subsequently, once the minute lockdown or minute restrictions were lifted, everything was done, and staff working flat out to really get students into the lab, and that happened over the summer period as well. I think where we, particularly in dentistry, for example, and some of our, other parts of the health faculties, actually students were in labs even during the pandemic, obviously in restricted numbers and observing social distancing and what have you. But it was the most challenging part of what we had to do, really. But I think that's how we managed it, quite simply.
Right. Jeremy, you must be seeing the new crop of medical students who become doctors and who are in your hospital now. It was for them, in some sense, almost, training by fire, because they suddenly saw the hospitals work in a very different way. What is your take on how their last years of education have been and how they're transferring to the real world of work?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably, early on in particular, we felt very sorry for them when we really wanted to get them in. There's nothing better than this type of healthcare challenge to really get particularly clinical students in and involved. And we tried very hard to do that, but obviously with the restrictions, they weren't getting the first bite of the cherry. It's a bit, as I said before, and a lot of what's being said now, and me at the beginning, is this pivotal moment now where what is going to help our, in this case, medical students, but we've just talked about the biochemistry students. What is going to help now is our bravery of being able to get people in where they're very much needed, side by side, in a face-to-face, face-to-test tube environment, face-to-patient environment. Clinical medical teaching can't be just done as simulation. It can't be just done with robots, so to speak. It's got to be done face-to-face. But bravery is needed to unpick the measures that are no longer necessary. I'd be very interested in Julia's perspective on this, where scientists have stood side by side with politicians, because in the first two waves, it was a bit easier to predict what was happening. It was easier to model. We had some very, very accurate model, almost based on Spanish flu, quite frankly. But with the third wave, our modeling has begun to let us down. And now, more than ever, we need to believe in the science and believe that things can start being normal. But I think that's much more difficult now, interaction between politicians and scientists.
And as you said last time, it's not only bravery, and bravery is there, because it'd be fair to say that the scientists who took those views were often roundly abused, certainly on social media, particularly those who call for vaccination often get targeted. Yet, vaccination is definitely a part of the answer. And Julia, you, of course, in your role at the Wellcome Trust, think about health in the most global sense of the word. And one of our viewers are interested to hear what's your global view of how COVID will impact us over the next year, given the different stages of the vaccination program all over the world. And I told you won't escape the question of Australia, so there is a question there. How would you compare their experience to ours? And we both had that experience, but I'll let you opine on that. So what do you think happens to the world, particularly here, the reference and the worries about the parts of the world that will remain unvaccinated for a long part of the world? And then, of course, the different approaches perhaps between Australia and the UK, almost diametrically different approaches.
Yeah, well, to take the first question first, I do think that we went into the pandemic with a sense that we were all in this together. That was the rhetoric. We're all in this together. And in many ways that, this was a challenge we were facing simply because we were human. And so around the planet, all human beings were facing the same challenge. But we've got to recognise that the way in which we've gone about the task of vaccination has created, a friend of mine uses the phrase, the jabbed and the jabbed not, and that's being done, obviously there are some people who could have had access to the vaccine who have chosen for whatever reason to not have it. But disproportionately, that is being done on income. And so when you look at the global statistics as to who's been vaccinated, it's in the high or higher middle income world. It's not in the low income world where vaccination rates are still often in single digits. And what should strike us powerfully about that is not just the inequity, it is the irrationality, because as I'm sure Jeremy and all of his scientific colleagues would say, the more virus that's out there, the greater is the prospect for a mutation that ultimately is capable of vaccine escape. And so it's actually in all of our interests to vaccinate everybody rather than have it just follow income patterns. So I do think one of the lessons we've got to learn is about pandemic preparedness. It's about a sense of global solidarity. It's whether we're going to build new systems in health that mean if we face a challenge like this again, we will genuinely live up to the rhetoric that we're all in this together. And that's, a complex set of questions, not only about how you fund scientific discovery, but how you stand up things like vaccine manufacture. So that manufacture is in all parts of the world, not just some parts of the world. So I don't have all of the answers there, but clearly they're the questions we need to puzzle through, and they're real time. People are already discussing what should the global health architecture look like to put us in a better state for the next pandemic. Then on differential approaches, Australia obviously closed the borders very quickly. I fled out of here last March, March 2020, and got home before hotel quarantine came into effect, but there was already home quarantine. And that was a strategy that at the start of the pandemic worked very well to keep COVID rates incredibly low and people's likelihood of getting the virus, let alone dying from it, very, very low. But clearly at this stage of the pandemic where you need to transition to people having the vaccination, I think there's been a series of issues about the supply of the vaccine, which are obviously very politically contested, so I won't go into those, and then a series of issues about community motivation to take the vaccine, when in many parts of the country your likelihood of getting COVID has remained very low. And there's been a set of issues flowing from Federation about how states have reacted differently in closed borders. So yes, I think quite a different set of reactions with different stress points. I think the stress points were much earlier here in the UK. There would have been many months when you would have said Australia was doing so much better than the UK. On virus rates right now, you'd still say Australia's doing so much better. But on vaccine rates, obviously, it's been much slower.
And if you're at a university in Australia, you're still not on campus in most instances, but you certainly are here. Time will tell who was right, but time's closing in on us. So perhaps I'll turn to each of you as to what you think might be the positive lasting legacy in all of this. So Jeremy, what do you think when we look back? We'll say, well, that was the positive lasting legacy of COVID on health.
I think, as I said in my bit, I honestly think the way clinical scientists, clinicians, everyone, all healthcare professionals pulled together to rapidly translate and work together to good effect, to absolute good effect, was a real lesson for us, and we must carry that forward. The outcomes were definite, so we want to carry that forward.
So we can do it faster and better, and we should know we can, and do more of it. Adam, one very good question that's come: what is King's doing to prepare students for this complex reality, and how will we make sure that King's graduates will be change makers rather than just change takers? Yes,
I think. Look, even before the pandemic, we were committed to the King's first year, which was our way of preparing our students for entry into university. But I think everything we've learned over the last 18 months, we've completely, we've completely transformed our thinking around that, and how imperative it is that we support them into university so that when they get here, they succeed from day one, and actually that how critical that is. But what we've also learned is how important it is at the other end. Actually, it's no use just clapping them as they trot across the stage. We've got to be assured that every King's graduate leaves us with the ability to thrive beyond. And I think, if anything, because we had to deal with this under such pressure in the last 18 months, I think it's reinforced the message that is critical. So this bookending of the degree, transition in and transition out, prepare for and prepare beyond, is really what you're going to hear a lot of in the next few years.
We will, and you're already talking about this. I think since we are amongst King's friends, you can tell us about the King's first year and the King's Edge as you talk about it.
Yes, that's our brand, King's first year, King's Edge, in capital letters. It really will make sure exactly that. Particularly King's Edge will be fascinating, because that's where we want to really engage alumni, and we want to, because that will be very much delivered in a digital space. It's about, although once the students are really focused on the exit and what comes after, to make sure that we're exposing them to the richness of what King's has to offer, and to make them feel part of this community, because that's when it matters most.
Well, thank you. And Julia, I turn to you for the last word. What do you think might be the lasting positive legacy of what in the short term just seems like, a difficult disaster?
Well, I do hope that, number one, we do keep talking about this we're all in this together question, and it requires us to stare inequity and discrimination in the face and address it. I am hopeful about the role of science. I accept what Jeremy says, that it's not easy, and we're in more contested moments now, but I do think that there will be a long-lived effect around science and evidence in public policy decision making. And I also think we're having a good discussion, and we need to see more of it, about styles of leadership. People would have seen during the depths of the pandemic, there were many reflections that countries led by women were doing better during the pandemic. Now, the evidence on that is equivocal, but I think that dialogue all started because people were really looking for leadership that combined strength with empathy. And what you can certainly say on the evidence is that the ultra macho, swaggering, expert opinions, evidence doesn't matter styles of leadership went the worst. Because the virus doesn't care about your macho swagger. It just gets on and does what it does, which is infect more people. And I think having put a spotlight on the weaknesses of that kind of leadership will stand us in good stead for the future of the world.
Oh, well, that's so nicely said. And in light of that, I think it's really sad, as you point out, that the number of expert speakers on matters to do with COVID were only, what you said, it was only 1 in 15 who were women when they should have been 50%. Well, thank you for correcting some of that, and we look forward to more of that. So to this wonderful panel, can I say thank you to all our guests who joined us, over 100 in different parts of the world. A good morning, good afternoon, and a good evening to you. And wherever you are, it was wonderful to get together in this way. And hopefully one day you'll get to come and see that wonderful quad and the pedestrianized strand that I talked about. Until then, be safe wherever you are. And thank you very much for joining us today. And thank